Hi, and welcome to the Adventures of Uber Dad. One of the most frequent questions I get from both riders and other drivers is whether or not I work for Lyft and if I'm doing double duty in the two rideshare services. There are other rideshare services, but in Los Angeles, the two predominant ones are Lyft and Uber. And as I mentioned in a previous podcast, the gist of it was that both came on the scene at about the same time. Lyft was offering a sort of lower end, more casual service with pink mustaches on the front of the cars and very friendly, whereas Uber had gone higher end and done essentially what was Uber Black, which was more of a luxury experience. You get in the car and there's gum and water bottles and these kind of things waiting for you. Uber has since gone down market, and they've introduced things like Uber X and Uber Pool, which I will talk about in the next podcast. They've sort of divided up their elite, whereas Lyft is now sort of expanding its coverage as well, and they've gone through a bit of a rebranding, and they're offering all sorts of incentives for you to compete and drive for Lyft as well. I personally have just been driving for Uber. I find that they offer enough financial incentives to compete with Lyft, and they keep me busy enough during the working hours that I'm able, as a part-time driver, to go ahead and get the maximum that I think I can get for doing this kind of work. However, in talking to other Uber drivers who do it full-time, they like to take the flexibility of doing both services. The reason for this primarily is not the pay structure, the base pay structure. If you're driving for one of the Uber Elite services, it may be that you can get a higher rate. I personally am driving a 2008 Prius, and I'm doing Uber X or Uber Pool, which is fine. And I find that a lot of people, even higher end people, tend to just want to take the cheapest service they can find anyway that they trust. So I tend to get all sorts of types that are taking this car. And with surge pricing and various financial incentives, I can make quite a deal of money. However, if I was working full-time, the incentives that Uber and Lyft offer are often very competitive and often ticky-tack one against the other. So I've talked to people who have a strategy of working for Lyft, and basically if the incentive is higher that week in terms of number of drives given or getting referrals, they will go ahead and do that, and then they will switch back to Uber when the incentives are higher for that. Sometimes they have the option of they'll drive a little while for Uber and feel like it's not going that great, and they'll go ahead and they'll shift over to Lyft. And if there's more of a demand for Lyft, they'll stick with that for a while. It's kind of playing blackjack tables at that point. There's no empirical evidence to say that it actually works, but they insist that it does. But I do find a validity in the idea of chasing the incentives, because for now, right now, for example, Uber is going full throttle at Lyft and trying to get drivers from Lyft to work for Uber full time. So they've offered a lot of incentives that I talked about in the previous podcast to get people on the road driving full time. So it can be much more profitable these weeks to drive for Uber until they pull back on some of those incentives. However, of course, there's going to be a lot of Uber drivers on the road, and it makes it more difficult to get those incentives. And if you drive for Lyft, since so many Lyft drivers are working for Uber at that particular time, you might find it easier to get rides and more rides, and they may have incentives to get you to drive or magnifiers against. I'm not sure if they use surge pricing or not. I believe they do. That will make it more valuable for you to drive on that particular service. So the good thing about it is I would imagine it gives you flexibility, particularly if you're driving full time. These things, there's a few blogs and podcasts out there that talk about these issues on a daily basis. So if you want to go ahead and look those things up, I think it's great. Just do a Google search for Uber versus Lyft or Uber podcast or Uber blog, and you're going to find a lot of them. And most of them tend to post the same things, which are what incentives are out that week, various stories that they've heard, and offering you an idea of how to make your driving the most profitable it can be, depending on which service you want to work for. There doesn't seem to be any sort of ramifications of driving between the two services. You are a 1099 independent contractor, so in theory you should be able to drive for any ride service you want, any hours that you want. And it seems that the companies are responding that way by trying to incentivize riders to come on board by offering financial incentives. So that is the way that it should work in a free market economy, and it's nice to have two big competitors like Uber and Lyft driving each other in a market like Los Angeles, because it makes it more equitable and it can be more profitable for you as a rider, and it gives more flexibility to the riders. More profitable to you as a driver, and gives more flexibility to the riders out there because they have some choices. I think that's it. So basically, there really are no consequences for you driving Lyft versus Uber. You can do both. And you just have to follow some simple guidelines in terms of representing your company well. Obviously, they're not going to want you soliciting riders for Lyft while you're in Uber, and I have heard of a couple of cases of people being let go because that was reported, and vice versa, I'm sure. So, use your common sense when you're doing it. Don't try and drive somebody as an Uber driver, then convince them to pick you up as Lyft because there's a bigger incentive. Be honest with the applications. Be honest with what you're doing. Stick to one or the other, depending on what you think is best for you, and you should be fine. If you have any questions about this, I can give you some anecdotes that I've heard from different people. I can point you to some specific podcasts or websites that people have referred to me that I find particularly useful in this. You can reach me at uberdad.la@gmail.com, or you can go ahead and post comments here at this video or one of the other ones, and I'll do my best to answer that. And again, if you are going to sign up for Uber for the first time and you want to go ahead and use my referral code, that would be great. You can find it on a link on my YouTube page here, or you can just enter it directly. It is R7F5BJXYUE. That referral code means a payment for both you and I. It fluctuates from week to week, but essentially you sign up for the service, and once you've completed a certain number of rides, then you get a financial reward and I get a financial reward depending on what it was the week that you signed up. And that's true for Lyft as well, I hear. So all the best in your driving for Uber. Hopefully this podcast has helped you, and I will see you in the next episode, which I believe is episode 13, and I'm going to talk about Uber Pool and how that works. Okay, bye-bye. Take care.